As we have seen in the previous videos, the early modern era has contributed significantly to the development of lyrical poetry, but also of epical poetry, of the essay, and even the beginnings of modern prose narrative, if you think of Utopia, for example. But of course, it is for its achievements in the theater that the period is most well known. When we think of early modern literature, we think of the drama, of tragedy, comedy, and also the histories. And this is what we want to focus on in the next series of videos. Now, this was an incredibly rich phase in English theater history. Although most of the plays written for the Elizabethan stage have been lost, there are still over 600 plays from that period that remain. So it's vastly more than just Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet. Although here as well we will focus heavily on Shakespeare, but really there is a wealth of material. So it's the time between roughly 1576 and 1642, and we'll talk a little bit more about those dates and the significance of those dates. But it's the period between these years that is seen as one of the richest in English literary history, particularly in the drama. And that was because, like no other art form, the theater was the place where social, economic, artistic, philosophical, and political developments of the time combined to generate a form of expression that was indeed unprecedented in earlier times and that remained as formative for the centuries to come. So it's sort of a point of convergence for so many things, and it made such a great platform for debating things. So we might ask ourselves, well, are these plays really the best that have ever been produced? Has nothing better ever been done afterwards? Now, of course, that would be ridiculous to say. Considerable technical and also artistic advances have been made by succeeding generations, but the stage at that time broke new grounds and thereby set norms for all following authors and texts, because so much innovation, so many new things were being developed. Those became then standards for the generations to come and continue to influence. So I think there are a few plays that have that kind of impact on the history of theater and literature in general. In a way, when we talk about this moment in history and in literary history, we can almost see it as a perfect storm where several conditions meet to form to form this phenomenon. One of them was just the popularity and the professionalization of theater. I'm going to talk later on about the stage. The stage also as a business model, so that's something that for the first time we have a professional theater. And of course, it is a time of immense and wide-ranging social and philosophical change. I try to sketch in the briefest way possible some of those changes that bring us from the Middle Ages into an early modern period, and I try to sketch the ambiguities, the fault lines in these, how philosophies clash with each other's, religions clash, and all of that gives rich material for debate and for fleshing out characters and so on and so forth. And of course, last but not least, there's a rooster of extremely talented writers that emerge out of this situation and make the best of these conditions and really use that to find forms of expression that have remained with us. We will talk much more about the excellencies and the features of these plays, but what I want to do in this video mainly is to look at some of the precursors, because though early modern theater did create something entirely new and entirely its own, it also did not develop out of nothing. It's not like there hadn't been any kind of theatrical staged entertainments, and then suddenly, boom, there is the early modern stage. That's not how it worked. So there was a medieval tradition of um, staging plays, but they were different in so many respects. So we'll look at two types of plays that we find in the medieval age. And the first one is the mystery plays, also sometimes called miracle plays. You already see here in the background a later rendition of how the staging of such a play or series of plays really could have looked like. The mystery plays and the miracle plays are amongst the earliest formally developed plays in medieval Europe. They are developed throughout a very large time frame from the 10th century to roughly the later 16th century, so until the time when the early modern stage takes over. Excuse me. They are focused, as the term miracle plays already implies, focused very strongly on representation of Bible stories. They're exclusively illustrations, staged, performed illustrations of episodes from the Bible. And they were also performed either in churches or around churches. So they were very strongly connected through the religiously organized society of the Middle Ages. But they were not staged by the church themselves, but rather by these guilds, the crafts guilds that emerged in the Middle Ages, the carpenters, the bakers, the tanners. These would be tasked with creating stages and staging parts of it. I said these usually are not sort of one large play, but rather a series of small plays that all just represent one small episode from the Bible, and each of these stages and each of these stagings with the costumes and everything would be done by one of the guilds, and that was the way that they were being financed as well, because obviously people didn't pay to see them. This was basically part of religious life in the Middle Ages. The most well-known of these is the Corpus Christi cycle. There are several of those cycles, and because of their nature, we do have the text of some of these cycles, but there's very little. If you read the plays, you will see that this isn't great writing or great sort of stage happenings. A lot of what made these plays special went into the staging itself, everything that had to do with the backgrounds, the stage, and the costumes. There were different ways to stage these. You could either have a number of stages that were all set on one place. This would be a representation of such a form where you can see that basically everything that I'm circling here, these are all different stages, and on each of these stages, one episode would be played basically on a loop. These were short, and they would, once they're done, they would do this again and again. And what people do is they basically walk from one end of this area to the other. And of course, what you see here, that's also a stage that is the hell mouth that will swallow the sinners in the end, in the apocalypse, of course. So you can see that these were very elaborate affairs. Another way to stage these, if would be to have the stages actually moving, and that will be done with these so-called pageant wagons. So you see here a representation of one of those. You can see down there. Circle this again. You can see some wheels here. So these were movable stages. So in this case, the spectators would be standing still, and they would wait for these pageant wagons to pass them by, and they would come along, play their scene, and then move along, and then a different wagon would come along. So this here is another of those pageant wagons. that you can see here from a medieval manuscript. The Ship of Fools, I think this is. So you also see that these, of course, had strongly moral, ethical overtones, that they basically gave the history of the universe in biblical terms, and that usually ends with both the images of damnation, but also, of course, of the resurrection. And just to give you an idea of the splendor of those affairs, and how little of that is actually kept in the texts themselves, I'm going to show you a few images from one of those series of wagons. So obviously these plays lack a lot of what we were interested in terms of theater, the drama, the development, the characters, and the character development. They're very much static in that respect. In this way, they're comparable to a phenomenon that emerged, especially in the 19th century, the so-called tableau vivant, where actors, people, amateurs would gather and basically imitate a well-known painting, and sort of pose in such a way. So we have a lot of the trappings of stage entertainment, but without any of the movement, without any of the action, and any of the narrative development. An even more modern version of that would be cosplay, which has a lot of interesting similarities to these mystery plays, and also to the tableau vivant, in that it's also a performed representation of a narrative character that is embodied through a character. One of the very important aspect of these mystery plays was, of course, the crucifixion, and that has, so in this case, the embodiment of Christ has a real theological overtone. So if you're interested in that connection, I've tried to sort of connect this very introductory style of lecture to a more research focused perspective. So I attached to this week's series of lectures an article that I've written doing exactly this comparison between mystery plays, tableau vivant, and cosplay. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out. It's not part of the Literature 1 module, but it's one of the ways, of the avenues, that leads outside into more interesting stuff. And the second precursor that I want to look at is the morality plays. So we already saw how the mystery plays, of course, had an educational value to them. The morality plays are very strongly focused on this aspect. They're another genre of medieval, but also early Tudor theatrical entertainment. So they're coming a little bit later in the development. They're basically allegorical forms, allegorical types, in which you have a protagonist, and that protagonist needs personifications. So characters that appear on stage, but that are not meant to represent real people, but rather personified aspects of things, virtues, and so on. We'll take a look at an example in a second. And so the protagonist usually meets personifications of moral attributes who try to prompt him to choose a goodly life over one of evil, and then there are other characters who try to prompt him towards evil, and this character has to make the right decisions. One of the well-known examples of this would be the summoning of Everyman, which was originally performed around 1510. So we can see this is it's not 10th century, but it's a little bit before the time frame that we sketched as the beginning of the the early modern theater. And in the name of the main character, Everyman, you can already see that he's, on the one hand, he's supposed to be a real character, a realistic character, a human being, but also not a specific character. He's every man, so he's supposed to reflect on all of us. This is the original, not the original, but one of the title pages of a 1530 edition of the book, where you can see that this is about death summoning everyone, and then every man needs to come forward and needs to defend his life. And if we look here, what you see here on the left side is the characters. The characters that appear in this play. Everyman, of course, messenger, God, death. But then also you see characters like fellowship, kindred, good deeds, knowledge, confession, beauty. So there you see that these are all heavily allegorical and heavily personified characters. So this is still very far from being a realist play or being a play about individualized characters, and still as an outgrowth of the mystery plays of the Middle Ages, these morality plays do represent a shift towards a more secular base for European theater, because now human beings start to sort of be of concern. I mean, they're framed, of course, in a religiously connotated ethical background, but at least they're on the stage. So if we want to sum up the importance of these precursors and how they tie into what we will then see emerge in the early modern stage, we can once again try to draw very, very large developments in very simplified ways, and we can say that what we see and what we experience in the early modern theater is both a secularization and an internalization. I will talk a little bit more about this, but I just want to sketch it here very briefly. So what we find in both the mystery plays and in the and still also in the morality plays is that there's sort of this religious battle between good and evil that is done by these either allegorical or mystical characters, God, the devil, the angels, and so on. And these struggles between good and evil, between factions of good and evil, will be secularized, made secular particularly in the histories, when we have the same struggles between political parties, advisors, and political factions. So this is the secularization aspect, but also the conflicts that we see emerge, particularly in the morality plays. This is about how to lead a good life and how to be a good person, and these are all the questions basically that human beings ask themselves about how to be good are being externalized. They're being actually represented by characters that are on stage, and we will see a gradual internalization of these conflicts, of these religious, political, moral conflicts, when they start to happen within characters, and it's the character development that is an expression of these struggles. And that, of course, in a way also mirrors the development in the shift from Catholicism to Protestantism, in which the individual and his mind becomes ever more important, and it's something that each individual has to make up with themselves. And you don't go to a priest to confess, so you don't have an external agent to talk to, but rather what you need to do is look into yourself and come to terms with yourself. And this is something that ultimately the early modern tragic characters will need to do, because in the end they're usually isolated and they don't have anyone to rely on but themselves. And finally, if you think that's an interesting topic, the morality plays and the emergence of a realist notion of drama, out of the morality place, there's a really very, very entertaining but also instructional novel called Morality Play by Barry Unsworth, which is about this troupe of actors who usually go from village to village to do their morality plays, and then they come to this inn, and then there's a murder happening, and then they in order to sort of find out something about the murder, they decide to stage what was going on, and thereby kind of develop a modern idea of theater. So that's a very good reading for your quarantine time.